2 buttons. And where's my chat window? Now, hang on a minute. Where the hell is my chat window? Oh, no. Oh, son of a bitch. Where did the chat window go? I'm having a small existential crisis. Because... Also, why is this stream freaking out right now? Sorry. It's giving me all different kinds of like warnings and blinking lights and shit. This is crazy. Why are you... There we go. There we go. Now we're back in business. Yeah, that was wild. Can I right click and turn on the chat? Where the hell's the chat window? Weird. All right. This is going to make it really difficult for me to sit here and answer chat questions if there's no chat window. Why is there no chat window? You guys are going to have to bear with me one more second while I figure this out. No, stop it. Nope. I know it's a very technical thing I'm doing here, but apparently at some point, like a dope, I turned off the chat window. There it is. I don't know why. Weird. All right, here we are. Chat window's going. This is streaming. This is doing stuff. All right. Neato Keen. Let's go. Hi, everybody. Thanks for... And there's the chat, and there it goes. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate seeing you. Thank you for checking this out. I want to start tonight, aside from my small technical issues, which have been, I think, handled. Hang on. No, one more second. Hang on. Stay there. Don't go anywhere. Listen to the sounds of whatever it is that's playing. Hang on. I got to press a button. Okay. We're back. Would you believe that I can, triple my connectivity? I can improve everything if I just have this door open? Yeah, that's really weird. I don't understand science sometimes. But whatever. Here we are. We're all the same. Okay. Let's do stuff. Tonight, we're talking trunk novels. We are going to define them, talk about what they are, and certainly what they're not. Talk about why they're important. Talk about why they're feared. And then what to do about them. Because... yeah, there's a lot to talk about here. I do want to start, however, I want to start with a little bit of story time. I want to start with, just this sort of general, well, really a setup as to how we got here. So I took a couple weeks off in December, mainly to get some stuff done around the house, pay some bills, see some family, do the holiday thing, And one of the things I had intended to do was get off of social media. Just kind of not be a part of it. Just kind of take a break for any number of reasons. And because I'm just a terrible person at it, doing poorly at it, I didn't really get a chance to, and I kept tuning back in. I tried really hard not to tweet so much. I tried really hard to kind of stay out of it, but like any good addiction, and me, the addict, it frequently doesn't always work that way. So all the same. Hello. Hi. Thank you for being here. Thank you for subscribing. It's delightful. Ooh. Hey, the subscription thing worked. Thank you for resubscribing. It means the world to me. And I hope you enjoy the little notification that just came up. Where was I? I was telling a story. So I took that time off in December to kind of do some stuff. And I couldn't help but get back on social media. And I got to tell you, when you're trying to avoid social media, when you're trying to actively not engage with it, but you see some of the the most directly aggravating things, the things that are guaranteed to press your buttons, the things that are absolutely designed to be the thing that you just want to fly off the handle at, it's very, very difficult. The entire time I was gone, while I was doing things and talking to people and moving furniture and cleaning out the fridge and vacuuming a million times and all this other stuff, I was thinking about some of the tweets, some of the material, some of the stuff I saw in the hashtag writing community about all different kinds of dumb shit. There were controversies about pricing. There were controversies about character development. And rest assured, we will spend some time at some point talking about them. They will come up again. But there were several particular moments across 6 or 7 days, not always at the same time, not always in the same conversation, where the trunk novel came up as a thing. People were talking about it. People were talking about it in the same sort of way you and I might talk about the dentist when we're little kids. Or we might talk about, that weird, creepy relative we don't really like to spend time with. The trunk novel was just absolutely reviled. It was the monster under the bed. It was the, oh my God, I can't believe, this thing's terrible. How, what do we do? How do we live with ourselves if we've made one? And the discussion was not really based in reality. It was all built on fear. It was all built on the sort of I heard from somebody who said so-and-so with such and such said this and this. And then what about that? I also heard. And it irritated me. It irritated me a lot because there's a history to the trunk novel, and knowing that history and knowing some of the stuff about a trunk novel makes it a lot easier to deal with. Because the conclusions these people, I'm hesitant to call them conclusions at all, but the statements they were making about what happens upon discovering they've got a trunk novel on their hands, or that they're X amount of afraid of a trunk novel. The statements they were making are absolutely banana pants dumb, just flat out wrong, and completely useless. So the general gist of this was there was a person. She, I'm 99% certain she identified as a female. She was complaining about how hard it was to write her book. Pretty typical writer stuff. No problems. It happens. Writing is difficult. Some days it's harder than others. Some days it's easier than others. But writing, by and large, can be difficult. And she was talking about how she was having trouble with not just the accountability of showing up every day and writing, which admittedly is a very difficult thing. She was having trouble kind of feeling like her work was good enough, and not in the imposter syndrome way, although I'm sure that played a part of it. But she was talking about it in terms of I read these other people's books, and the stuff they're doing in the books seems to be better than mine. Sort of not an imposter author syndrome, but maybe an imposter prose syndrome. They are writing sentences better than I am. They are conveying different things that sound cooler than the stuff I'm writing. That kind of stuff. And the advice, and imagine pterodactyl-sized air quotes when I say advice here. The advice she was receiving from people who I guess claimed to be her friends. I mean, honestly, if they were my friends, I'd find some new ones. But all the same, the advice, hi Linus, the advice she was getting from these humans was not particularly great. In fact, it made everything worse. It actively made everything worse. Because they were telling this lady, this person writing this book, experiencing pretty straightforward writer issues. She was telling this lady, hey, just give up. Just stop. It's not working. And as the discussion sort of bloomed, as it kind of took shape and stuff, and of course I'm reading this thing just seething, just getting progressively more frustrated. I want to tweet about it and jump online, and I promised I wouldn't, and I had other stuff to do, and by the time I could make time to do it, the conversation had long since passed, but it had, drilled its way into my brain. So I'm sitting there and I'm listening to, I'm reading all this, and they're saying things like, oh, well, trunk novels are terrible. They're the worst thing ever. It's really bad. Everybody does them, and it's just the worst. But if you keep finding that you're doing them all the time, the thing you need to do, and I'm paraphrasing here, is go find something else you're good at, which is the worst writing advice. I don't even think it's writing advice. It's more just like, beat it, kick rocks advice I've ever heard. And that's been stewing in my head for like 2.5 weeks now. Absolutely positively just like spinning around in my brain. So allow me tonight to exercise some of those thoughts and clean out some of the brain clutter in my headspace. And at the same time, give you a different way to frame the trunk novel and a different way to sort of deal with it. That's not even the right thing. That sounds melodramatic. It's not like this burden or an albatross. And honestly, it isn't even the monster under the bed. It's just a thing. It's just something that happens. It's just, in some cases, it's part of the process and not necessarily to be demonized or ignored or felt bad over. Just part of the process. That's why we're talking about trunk novels tonight. So, where do we begin? I think we need to begin with a definition, or at least in terms of what a trunk novel is and what a trunk novel isn't, because there are way too many people making way too many assumptions as to the definition of a trunk novel and as to its place in publishing and its statement on your craft as a writer, and they're almost all wrong. And if they're not wrong, they're only, bits and pieces of the whole story. You'd have to stitch 2 or 3 of these definitions together to get a more accurate picture. So I want to start by laying out the reality of a trunk novel. First of all, you need to know that a trunk novel, or just the term trunk novel, is not a publishing term. It's one of those terms that we sort of adopted into publishing. It is not a given term. It's not the same thing as like manuscript, agent, editor. It's not a codified term. It is a term gathered from social exposure. Writers talked about it. Writers mentioned it. Other people heard writers talk about it and mention it. And it sort of fell its way into the publishing vernacular. It is not a label applied by publishers typically. Usually they'll just refer to manuscripts as publishable or unpublishable, or manuscripts under contract and not under contract, or something like that. But the label has sort of made its way into the language in kind of an invasive way, frankly. The other major point I want to make here is that I think the only reason we talk about trunk novels now is because we have a term for it. If we didn't use the term trunk novel, if we were to yank that out of our vocabulary, I think we would get a different experience with it overall. Because it's not a publishing thing. It's a writer thing. And 90-something% of the time, the writer or a writer is the one who's going to apply the trunk novel label to the manuscript in question. As an editor, when I'm handed a book that's just not gonna go, it's not gonna make it, I will call it a trunk novel when I explain it to the writer. But in terms of my own internal, like, this is how I think about the manuscript, this is what I think it could do, it's more just a matter of it doesn't have the boxes ticked, or it doesn't have the structure it needs in order to move forward. It's not a business term, I guess, for lack of a better word. Oh, I got a very nice little update there. Thank you. The point I'm trying to make in all this is that, particularly in the hashtag writing community, I think an awful lot of people make an awful lot of hay, like a giant ass fuss, about a thing that is about as scary in the unknown as you can imagine. But once it's known, it's sort of, it's kind of like, oh, that's all it is. Because what a trunk novel is a manuscript that's complete that you have not pursued publishing on for any number of reasons. It's a thing that's done. Now, maybe it needs some work, maybe it needs some polish, maybe it needs an editor. It probably does. It needs something done to it, but it's done. And in theory, you could publish it. Now, the term itself, if we want to talk history, is about 100 years old. Early 1900s, this term started getting really, really used in New York City in traditional publishing circles, where writers would lament the fact that they were writing and trying their best every day between all the cigarettes and alcohol and the trouble with the dames and the suffrage and just trying to make it through their incredibly privileged white guy lives, and realizing that no matter how hard they worked in the seat of their patriarchy and privilege, that sometimes the writing just wasn't so great. And the demands of their editors and publishers, agents weren't really a thing at the time, the demands of their editors and publishers seemed Herculean. That they had to, climb the impossible and do the daring do and walk on water and whatnot in order to produce the book that the other people wanted. And oh my God, isn't their life as a white hetero man in the 1920s, isn't their life just the worst for it? And the trunk novel became a term for the book they wrote that didn't make the grade. It wasn't the thing somebody was after, but it was complete. And so it would be filed away into a steamer trunk, a big ass box in a closet, essentially. And that was fine and well and true. And it became sort of the boogeyman in terms of story structure because, everybody wanted to, a lot of writers find it necessary to develop this idea that there's some kind of scary monster in the corner, that there's some kind of problem, that there's some thing they need to fight against or run from or make progress against in order to succeed. Because it's easier to pose their actions against someone else as opposed to, believing in themselves and just being self-directed positive. Self-talk for them is harder than creating an enemy. So they create an enemy in the form of a trunk novel and say things like, well, if I ever write a trunk novel, I'll just quit writing. Big hyperbolic shit like that. Because a trunk novel's just a novel. It's living in a trunk. It's sitting in a box in the garage, or it's printed out in a on the side of the desk. It's still a novel. And the thing that really sort of takes all the air out of this balloon, the thing that sort of sucks away all the what's the word I want to use? Like the drama of it is self-publishing. Self-publishing eliminates the trunk novel. I don't know why we don't talk about that more. Yeah, it might not be the bestest seller of all time to rival, religious texts and old-fashioned writers, but you could still self-publish it. Somebody might buy it. You can market it strongly. You can, we'll talk about what you can do about a trunk novel soon, but self-publishing defeats the trunk novel. It's the paper to the rock in rock, paper, scissors. Because it's just a matter of publishing it. It's just a matter of pressing the button, rolling the dice, and seeing what happens. But you could still do it. Because originally the only arbiter between trunk novel and novel was the fact that it's publishable. Now, here's the thing. Here's the tricky part. Traditional publishing puts the control over publication in somebody else's hands. An agent, an editor, a publisher, somebody is going to sit there and pass a judgment on your work to determine, oh, yes, this is publishable. What they're really all saying is, oh, yes, this is marketable. I can make money from this. Money can be made from this. And that's not the same thing. That's the first point to make tonight. Don't confuse marketable for publishable. Because self-publishing, you can publish any goddamn thing you want. You want to make a 2-page novel that's just a list of profanity you've called, a former relationship? Go for it, by the way. That's a great idea. Feel free to do that. But it's just publishing. When we turn that corner and we stop thinking about it in terms of marketability, a lot of the monstrosity of the trunk novel, a lot of the stuff that scares and freaks people out goes away. Because when they talk about, oh my God, I can't publish that book, it's not because they lack the functionality. It's not because they lack the ability to produce the digital file into another format or the digital file into a physical format. It's that it doesn't bear the expectation of, when I do that, sales will follow. And that's sort of the big hurdle here, because a trunk novel is just a novel that you haven't figured out what it needs to do or have done to it in order to be published and sold and have it sell to consumers. A trunk novel is not sort of the big badge of shame to boot you from the village to send you off into the woods to be torn apart by animals. The trunk novel is not your one-way ticket to Loserville. It's just a thing. It's a label for a thing that doesn't entirely fit or doesn't entirely work anymore. It's outdated, and I don't know why we still use it, but here we are talking about it. So somebody somewhere must care about this. Somebody somewhere has to need this label, right? Because it keeps hanging around. So, yeah, trunk novel. An outdated idea, built entirely on the conspiracy and the confusion of publishable and marketable. So tonight, what I want to do for some amount of time, I don't know how long, but some amount of time, half hour, 45 minutes maybe, is walk you through what to do about it. Walk you through the fact that this is not an automatic, push the red button, fire up the, danger alarm and prepare to bail out. You don't have to. You don't have to. And one of the things I want to make real clear here is that I want to change your definition. I want you to think about changing your definition of a trunk novel. And it's no longer this, terrible thing you wrote that's an albatross around your neck that's, a waste of all your time. And oh my God, you can't believe you spent all this effort doing it and this is what you're left with. It's nothing like that at all. When you hear discussions of a trunk novel, whether it's coming out of your face or somebody else's, or you're reading it on a screen or whatever, whenever trunk novel comes up, I want you to think about practice. Whether that's exercise or rehearsal or test drives or anything like that. Whatever mode of pre-final performance we're talking about, I want you to think about practice. Because a trunk novel is great practice. But that's not to say that its only value is in practice, and that when you're ready to do it again or do it better, you have to automatically start blank. You don't. However, for the vast majority of people, starting off fresh with a completely different idea is super helpful. But we'll get there. We'll get there. We're not there yet. For now, the really important thing here is to, instead of demonizing them, and if you're about to have that thought, or if you've already had the thought of, oh my God, a trunk novel has wasted my time, it hasn't. Anything we do, whether it's a query letter that gets rejected, or research for a character, or a synopsis that we're muddling our way through, or our 20th attempt at chapter 10, or the sales copy on our webpage, or whatever. Anything we're trying to do, no matter how it gets received, the production of it, the doing of it, and how we can feel about it can teach us something about our art. It is through that effort, whether, practice, first attempt, sixth attempt, 10th attempt, working offline before you go online, whatever you want to call it. It is that effort that allows us to draw our own conclusions for when it comes time to, assess how we like a thing or how good we think we are at a thing and whether or not we want to do more of it. For instance, let's say you're working on writing better query letters, so you start knocking out a couple sample query letters and you find you enjoy it. And over time, if you keep at it, you might even get good at it. It might come very naturally to you, and that's fine if it does. Or maybe your thing is synopses. Or maybe your thing is, you're great at thinking up the premise of stories, but maybe you struggle elsewhere. But there's always something positive. There's always something noticeable and notable that you can find in your efforts. A trunk novel is a whole fresh buffet of those things. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to produce a highly successful, super publishable, highly in demand book in order to be good, air quotes, good as a writer. Yeah, I understand that loads of other people from loads of other places are going to try and assign that quality label to you based on your sales, based on capitalism, in part because they're part of the problem and in part because they don't know any better. But all the same, your measure and your yardstick for goodness and quality should not necessarily be tied only to sales. Because I have read some great books that sold terribly. But the measure for a reader's good in a reader, what a reader thinks a good book is not the sales of the book, right? We've read plenty of books, you and I. We've talked about tons of things. You've read tons of things. And maybe a book that you thought was amazing was average. It didn't make the bestseller list. Or if it did, it didn't stay very long. Or it's from an author that maybe not a lot of us have heard of. But that doesn't mean the book was bad. What you're responding to, what clicked with you, what resonates with you is your emotional and imaginative experience with the art within that book. That's what moved you. That's what excited you. That's what makes that book good for you. The same is true when you're writing. It's not that your draft is automatically bad or your premise is terrible. And it's certainly, unlike the advice given to this lady in this thread I read on Twitter, you certainly don't have to give up and find something else you're good for. It's just that you need to be able to look at your work at whatever stage it is, no matter what the work is, at whatever stage it is, and find the good thing in it. Okay, this is my second attempt at a query letter. It's better than my first. Okay, I'm learning. I'm getting a handle. I'm getting better at what not to do. And that's fine. If you can always point to the progress you're making, if you can always point to something where you can give yourself some praise, it's worth it. And the same is true of a trunk novel. It's a whole-ass book. But for some number of reasons, and we'll talk about some of them because there's too many to go through, but for some number of reasons, it just hasn't progressed forward in its lifespan. Maybe it's an idea that had a very finite quality to it, like you didn't think all the way through the story points. Or maybe the plot was really limited. Or maybe you started it and then lost interest because another idea came along and then like a cat with a laser pointer, you immediately got distracted. Or maybe it was just too big. Maybe you've, made it so large in one file that instead of having one giant ass book, you've really got 2 or 3 maybe in one file. And just by splitting it up and breaking the pieces off, you're not eliminating things, you're just reorganizing. But maybe that makes it more potentially viable for the mode of publishing you want to produce. Remember, a lot of this stuff is dependent on what it is you want to do with it, because self-publishing eliminates the trunk novel. You could take a novel, finish it up. It doesn't need to be edited. You don't have to edit it. You could slap together your own cover. You could speed your way through this to the end line. Totally. Write a book, proofread it, hit F7 in Microsoft Word, slap a cover on it, call it a day. You could sell that book. You could put it up on Amazon, charge 99 cents, and whatever it is whatever it is, and maybe you make a couple bucks. Maybe you don't. But you'd be published. You'd be just as published as somebody who, spent weeks going through this, hiring an editor, getting a good cover artist, writing sales copy, doing all the bells and whistles. You'd be just as published as them, and you'd be just as published as somebody who queried their first book and nurtured it all the way along and found the right sort of capitalist relationship to support them as an artist and not exploit them too much so that they could get a physical hard copy of their book. You'd be just as published. Don't be afraid of the trunk novel. You don't need to. You could always just run for the finish line here. You'd have to live with the consequences, and you'd have to mitigate or manage your expectations in terms of like how well you do in terms of sales, if that's a metric and a stick you want to measure everything by. But you also don't have to give a shit about that. You could just say, I put out books. And if people love them, they love them. If people don't, they don't. But I'm still producing books because I like to produce books. Now, maybe for some of you listening to this, that's more than a little radical. That's fine. We're not at that discussion point yet, you and I, where I can sit down and tell you like, hey, it's not about the money. That'll come later. We will eventually have that discussion on some Monday night. But for now, I know a lot of people get into this because they want to transition from whatever they're doing now into writing full-time and writing well enough in their full-time to support their, existence. And more power to you if that's what you're aiming for. But if you're aiming for that, then you definitely need to make friends with the trunk novel. Absolutely you do, because you are going to end up producing more of them than anybody else I talk to when I talk about, the people who speed to the finish or the people who sort of take a thing and then sit it down and take their time with it. If you are looking to produce a novel and become a novelist who makes their living, pays their bills, feeds their family on the strength of their writing, you will need to contend with the idea that the trunk novel is not the obstacle that everyone says it is. Because what a trunk novel does is it creates opportunity. Is it about whether or not you're going to see this idea all the way through? Is it challenging you to think of the idea all the way through? Is it challenging you and giving you the opportunity to produce character arcs? Is it challenging you in the ability to put a picture in the reader's head? Is it challenging you to, tie your ideas together? Is it challenging you just to finish what you start? You've got to think about this in terms of opportunity rather than obstacle. Because as a trunk novel goes, it's only as much of an obstacle as you make it. And it's never a sign that, oh my God, what you really need to do is go get into like basket weaving or some completely different creative pursuit. Trunk novels are things that happen. It's up to you if things stay in the trunk. So maybe, after I get this mouthful of water, we should talk about how a story turns into a manuscript and then turns into a trunk novel. Maybe we should talk about the evolution of a trunk novel before we talk about how to do something with a trunk novel. But first, while I have a mouthful of water, everybody good? We're all clear? The audio is fairly consistent? I'm not seeing too many indicators that, the signal is shit tonight. I have yet again moved everything in the house around to facilitate good connectivity. So far, so good. Mouthful of water. And then we're talking sort of how do we get a trunk novel in the first place? That was pretty good. All right. It's good. Awesome. That's all I need to hear. Thank you for saying so. So what exactly is the lifespan of a trunk novel? How did we get here? How do we do anything? As with any idea, it starts with the simple production. you have an idea, you start writing something down. Now, maybe you don't start writing on page 1. Maybe the thing you're writing is like 200 pages in. Maybe you write the climax first. I don't know. You start producing this idea. And over time, you start producing this idea at length. And hopefully, you produce this idea at length consistently. And it becomes a habit. And then through that consistency, through that repetition, through those efforts, the amount of stuff you produce increases. You go from, a page here, 2 pages there, 10 pages here, 15 pages there. Over time, you start shaping out and roughing out a whole idea. And then past that, you start looking at, its overall story structure. First act, second act, third act, climax, resolution, character development. It starts becoming a manuscript. At some point, once the story is all told, and it moves from beginning to middle to end, and you've completed it once, that's your first draft. Trunk novels, or the idea of creating a trunk novel, can arguably and technically show up here. Because if you write this first draft, and it doesn't matter what it's about, and we'll talk about what it's about later, but it doesn't matter how long it took you, it doesn't matter the immediate subject matter right now, it's just the fact that you wrote this book. It is a first draft. Doesn't matter if it's, supposed to, making big air quotes, supposed to be 90,000 words, and you wrote 120. It doesn't matter if, it's not supposed, air quotes, to change tense, but you've changed tense a few times. It doesn't matter if, you've got a lot of vague pronouns, because it's not supposed to. Doesn't matter. You have told a complete story. Oh, thank you so much for subscribing. It's wonderful to have you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I always love a good resubscription. I want to add noises to that. I have to look at how to do that tomorrow. In between my giant chunks of editing, I will fuck around and find out and see if I can get some other non-stock noises involved. I don't know, something funny, something to make me laugh. But anyway, thanks so much for resubscribing. You mean the world to me. Where was I? Right, the first draft. So, with this first draft, the most important thing is that it's done. That you finished a first draft. You showed yourself that you were capable of making this thing happen. It used to be an idea. That idea became a few paragraphs. Those paragraphs begat pages. Those pages begat chapters. Those chapters begat acts. Those acts begat story structure, which became first draft. That's huge. Big, giant, applause. Have some air horns. You got to understand that about 3/4, if not 80%, of all the people who sit down to do the thing you just did will never get where you were. The vast majority of writers, will get to the sort of that tipping point where they have pages and they need to become chapters, and those chapters need to become acts, and they stop. Now, maybe that's happened to you a few times too. It doesn't ultimately matter. It's an example, but all the same, a lot of people never get to the finish the first draft threshold. But that's also the first instance where the trunk novel conceptually could happen. Because if you wrote this thing, and it doesn't matter how big it is or what it's about, but if you wrote this thing and you're like, this was not for me. I saw it all the way through. I finished it. I'm proud of myself. But you know what? This just isn't my jam. It's fine. It's totally fine. Take that draft. You could delete it. You don't have to show anybody. It is technically something that will stay away from publication. It meets the criteria for a trunk novel. I understand it's a first draft. I understand it's not edited. I understand it has no cover. It has no sales copy. It has no ISBN. It has nothing like that at all. But it is a complete story. And it's a complete story that you just haven't moved it forward in its lifespan yet. That's a trunk novel. Is it bad? Is it really wrong to do that? Now, sit with that for a second, because I'm not asking you if the story is bad. I'm asking you about the judgment you make on yourself and your expectation of yourself and your effort, if that's bad. This isn't me challenging and telling you, well, you said you wanted to be a writer, so why aren't you writing? That's not this. That's a different discussion for a different day. We'll have that argument on Wednesday, you and I. But for now, I'm asking you, are you done with it? Are you happy with it? Are you happy stopping there? Or do you want to keep going? That question's going to come up over and over tonight, so get used to me saying it. If you're happy, or satisfied at least, but you don't want to go any further, congrats. You did write a first draft. You have produced a trunk novel. You are free and clear as always to do literally whatever the hell you want. And that's fine. Good for you. You did a hard thing. If this hard thing is sort of the first big hard thing before we deal with other hard things, like getting back into the manuscript, revising it, producing a second draft, then this is that sort of moment where we take a deep breath and get back into it. Because the reproduction from this point forward at any time between I've just finished my first draft and, all right, I'm going to publish this thing in some way, shape, or form, at any time in this process, you could stop. You could stop mid-sentence. You could stop mid-word. You could do whatever. But then you could stop and not come back, and this would turn whatever you've produced into a trunk novel. Is that so bad? No. Remember, I wanted you to think about this in terms of practice. You've practiced. Now, maybe the more shitty thing to say is that one of the things you're practicing is that you're practicing quitting. But again, that's a different argument for a different day. But you've got to instead of looking at the negative things you're practicing, look at the positives. You wrote a first draft. You started revising it. You've been practicing revision. You've been practicing making decisions. You've been practicing crafting story and making sure it's clear. Those are not insignificant concepts as a writer. I know they're not very glamorous. I know there's no big giant paycheck involved. I know there's no, internet celebrity for, hey, I unfucked chapter 2. But all the same, this is what you're practicing. So let's suppose you write this first draft and everything's going along swimmingly well. And you decide, okay, I'm going to go revise and really dig in and make a second draft. I'm going to start making cuts. I'm going to start shaping the story. I'm going to rewrite a couple things that I know I don't like, and I'll go back through and I'll do my best. So you start on your second draft, and it's coming along, and you're fired up, and you're doing great. And that's wonderful. And let's suppose you finish this second draft. Again, doesn't matter how long it takes you. Doesn't matter what the story's about right now. We're not that's coming. We're going to have that discussion in a second. But for now, content doesn't matter. It's just more of a binary issue. Did you finish the second draft or not? If you did, great. You have climbed and ascended to even rarer air, where even fewer people of all the total number of people who have ever written have reached. Because a lot of people tap out after that first draft, or they get bogged down in revisions and they never finish their second draft. Give yourself some air horns. It's pretty great. So let's suppose now you've done 2 drafts. You could publish this. It's finished, isn't it? You could publish it. Wouldn't be a trunk novel then. It'd be a published manuscript. You could do it yourself. And if you're sitting there going, yeah, but if I publish it, there's a chance that I won't get the sales, the response, the reviews, the whatever. And that's true. That's very true. You won't know until you try. But that's more a case of you using the expectation of what you want the future to be to dictate your present. That just means you've defined it as, in order for me to be a good enough author, I have to have this many things happen. Which is not germane to trunk novels. That's you putting pressure on yourself, trying to make a writing career be a certain way. And I'm not saying that to discourage you at all from having a writing career. I'm trying to get you to see that there's more to it than saying, oh, I need to have this many sales. Oh, I need to have this many stars. Those are, in the big scheme of things, separate and almost unrelated to your effort. Because if it made you happy to do it, Why not? If this were not writing, if this were another creative thing like knitting, crocheting, cross-stitch, painting, and you were just producing stuff that you'd hang up on your own walls, isn't it enough that you're happy with it? You're not looking to sell it to, lady across the street number 6. You just wanted to produce a thing. Well, you produced a thing. Give yourself some credit. Get some air horns. But let's suppose you go through the second draft and you decide, nah, I think I can publish this. I don't just want this for the sense of completion or the sense of praise and pride. I want to go forth and do stuff with it. Cool. Neat. Let's go. So you decide, all right, I'm going to revise it one more time and I'm going to start looking for experts or other people to come in and assist positively. Ideally, you're going to experts and not just grabbing 4 randos. But you're trying to get actual help to actually move forward, whether that's an editor, whether that's some beta readers, whether that's some kind of class you want to take, or whether that's some resources you want to avail yourself of, whatever. You're doing something to seriously move forward and make progress between second draft and third draft. And again, doesn't matter how long it takes. Doesn't matter what the book's about right now. It just matters that you're going from first draft to second draft and not quitting, and second draft to third draft and not quitting. The trunk novel, now the old way we used to talk about trunk novels was that they were a sense of failure. I'm trying to get you to reverse that and see it as a sense of accomplishment. Hey, look how far you've come. You made a third draft. I understand this is our hypothetical example, but roll with me on this. You got a third draft. That's even fewer people than who did the second draft, and even fewer still than the people who did the first draft, and even fewer still than the people who never finished the first draft. This is great. Good for you. This is awesome. Why are you not giving yourself some air horns? You deserve it. But it's at this point, you're probably feeling some kind of pressure. Because when it was a first draft, you were just kind of getting the idea out. When it was a second draft, you were just trying to polish it. But now you've done so many drafts, and probably enough people around you in your orbit are aware of what you've been doing, and they're going to probably start asking or questioning or planting the seed or making the demand or something, and you're probably also going to, do it to yourself. Well, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to publish it? You've come this far. Usually, there is a crossroads here. There's a tipping point. There's a decision to make. Because you could finish your third draft. You could revise the hell out of it. You could spend the next 60 years revising that third draft. Constantly tweaking it, honing it. Changing this word, changing that word, adding hats, taking away hats, adding a dog, taking out the dog, putting in more birds, putting in fewer snakes. Changing this hair color, changing that shoe, whatever. You could make 1 billion trillion changes until the end of time. And whether you're doing that to disguise the fact that you don't want to take the next step, or that you're scared of the next step, or that you're unsure of what the next step is, doesn't matter for this discussion. But this is usually between second and third draft, or second draft and publication in some space like there. That's where development hell creeps in. That's where revision hell creeps in. Just the constant tinkering. Now, ages ago, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, we were taught that a trunk novel is the novel you forever tinker with but never finish. And somehow, some way, that definition was supposed to suggest that the thing you were tinkering with by its own nature wasn't good enough. That it was because of the book and because of the book's content that you constantly had to go fuck with it. And that doesn't work anymore. Because the vast majority of the time, people who are stuck in revision hell, people who are stuck constantly writing and rewriting, people who are constantly, not finishing, it's not because of the content of the book. It's because of what's in their head, whether that's a fear or an expectation or both. They've told themselves that it's got to be a certain way. It's got to be perfect. It's got to be like this. It's got to not have this many mistakes. It's got to be like that. It's got to do this when it's done. They've created this very elaborate, success dog agility course where they've got to like run through tubes and around slaloms and up and down tilty things and who knows what, hoping they'll get a treat when they're all done. They've manufactured some particular avenue for their success. And the difficulty they perceive in accomplishing it seems directly related to the amount of fear or resistance or hesitation or avoidance they feel in reaching it. Because if you blow up, oh man, and you start thinking about how it's got to be a certain way, and you think about how far you are today from that end result, it's entirely reasonable to think you will absolutely just bottleneck yourself and freak out and lock up and maybe stop writing for a while because you freaked yourself out. Totally reasonable. I've done it, oh God, like at least once a year for the last couple of years, not counting the pandemic. Like, it happens. It's a human thing. I'm not saying it's a great human thing, but it's a human thing. We can do something about it. The trunk novel is no longer a failed novel. Trunk novel is a practice run. It just depends on what it is you want to practice. Because at this point, 3 drafts in, multiple revisions in, days, weeks, months, years of time invested, you've got a lot of practice. This isn't just you scribbling out ideas, doing whatever. This isn't just you polishing those ideas for the first time. This is you really crafting something, ideally. We'll talk about that in a second. But this is really you doing your best. So, being asked or deciding what it is you want to do with it, totally normal. And it's okay, despite all the pressure from the #writing community, it's totally okay if your answer is, I'm publishing it. I just wanted to write it. There's nothing wrong with that. My mom's been cross-stitching for like 60 years. Some of her stuff won awards when she did those kinds of things, but now she just stitches for the fuck of it. Totally fine. I know poets who produce poetry that, maybe show up as partial phrases in tattoos on their body. But by and large, they're mostly just writing to write. It's okay. And it's okay if you want to change your definition of the expectation of success. Other people might want to slap that trunk novel label to it, but fuck them. Let them write their own books. You and your decisions are the most important thing when it comes to your creativity. How do you feel about it? And if you're happy with it being the way it is, then you're happy with it being the way it is, and we can all go home. We can all have a nice night. We can all take off our pants and have nachos. But if you're unhappy with it, okay, what do you want to do with it? Press on, go forward? Sure. And here's where expectation meets reality. Because let's say you do 3 drafts or 4 drafts or 7 drafts or whatever. You do some amount of drafts and you say you swear up and down after having your friends look at it, your writing group look at it, your beta readers look at it. It seems like everybody who you don't have to spend a dime on has looked at it. Because, what is an editor now? God, they're just out there to make your job worse. They're going to tell you what you did wrong. You don't want that. Who wants to be told what they're doing wrong? That's crazy talk. So instead, you've managed to find yourself just enough people who will ask you non-threatening questions, who will give you not necessarily poor advice, but loosely structured advice that vaguely makes you feel like you've accomplished a big thing. You want to give yourself some air horns. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, they're a little insincere, but all the same, you want to publish this sucker. Great, good for you. And you decide, as so many people do, that the only way to publish this thing would be to traditionally publish it because everything else is fake, right? It doesn't really count. It's fraudulent in some way. It's hollow. It's amateurish. And you're not an amateur. Damn it, look how many days, weeks, months, years you spent producing this thing. Like, you're anything but an amateur. Doesn't matter if it's your first book. Doesn't matter that you've never done this before. Doesn't matter that, you didn't sit down thinking you'd ever get this far. It doesn't matter that you have all the earmarks of amateur. What matters is that you're going to traditionally publish this thing. And you've Googled and you've read hashtags and you've watched YouTube videos of, doughy, balding men and angry, white women arguing about the things you need to do and not do. You've done all the homework you can think of. So you write your query letter demanding to get a pimp, an agent, and you do your best. And you start getting rejected. And you start getting rejected not because the system is designed to reject far more than it accepts, and you're getting rejected not because, it's a flooded market and you're querying at an inopportune time, and you're not getting rejected because it's your first goddamn query letter and nobody writes a good query letter off the bat. You're getting rejected and you draw the conclusion, as so many people do, you draw the conclusion that your work sucks. That everybody was wrong. That you were wrong. That this was a whole waste of your time. Because you immediately weren't heralded like a hero marching into a conquered city. You were not showered in rose petals. You were not, thrice offered a kingly crown. You were not, led fanfares with genuflection and trumpets. There's no musical being made about your life. Nothing. You're getting rejection letters, forum rejection letters, which are allegedly, according to the internet, the worst kind of rejection letter. And so you draw the conclusion that everything sucks. This was a lie. You wasted your time. And you take this book that you worked very hard on, this piece of art that you really made an effort on, and people read, and you were vulnerable enough to let some people read it. And you immediately conclude that this is horseshit and you give up. Do you know how many people do that? Do you know how many people do that today? And I think if we're all really quiet for like 3 seconds, hang on. I think if we're all really quiet for like 2 or 3 seconds, we can hear somewhere on the internet, somebody somewhere quitting. Shh. Just listen for a second. Just wait. I think right there. That was somebody giving up. It happens all the time. It's just a thing. People get rejected. They don't get the immediate response they want. They take their work that they've worked really hard on and they shelve it. They make their own trunk novels. They call themselves a failed writer. They call their experiment in a draft that they worked hard on, that they got advice on, that they did homework on, that they really tried. They take all that stuff and they just say, oh, well, it was a waste because I didn't get the response I wanted. I never played baseball before, and my first time up, I never hit a home run. I never won the World Series on my first pitch I ever swung at, so I must be a waste. Insert your favorite sports metaphor there if baseball wasn't the thing. Maybe you want to win the Super Bowl on the first time you ever played football, or won the World Cup if you kicked a soccer ball. You do you. But I think you see the point I'm making. The trunk novel label isn't applied by the editor or the publisher or the pimp. It's applied by you. And it's applied by writers on their own work more than anywhere else because of the expectations they have around it. And I'm trying to tell you flat out, very simply, it's a dumb label. You don't need to do it. Are there books that need help? Yes. Do some books need more help than others to get out the door, to be published in the way they are intending to be published? And are there ways to improve their odds and improve their success down the road to some degree? Sure. But, a lot of that's we won't know until we try kind of stuff. But it's up to you, just like quitting. It's up to you to decide whether or not this thing's a trunk novel. It's up to you to decide whether or not you take your manuscript and say, yeah, I'm done. And sidebar, it's up to you to say whether or not you're done with just this one book or whether you're done with writing. That's always going to be your decision. Those are always your choices. That's always on you. Do not sign that power over to other people. Do not give them that ability to make that determination for you. It's a mistake to do that. And I would love for you to not make that mistake. So please don't. So I want to counter for a second before I get a mouthful of tea. I want to counter the idea that everybody writes trunk novels. And I want to be really careful when I say this, because I'm not saying it to suggest that only the bad writers write trunk novels, everybody else writes bestsellers. It's not that at all, because it isn't only the extremes that we exist in. It's not just super polarized like that. Again, self-publishing eliminates the trunk novel, because you can just publish it. Ideally, it's complete. But any number of drafts, any number of times. Have you seen some things? People publish first drafts all the time, and all the feedback they get are, this could have used an editor. There's too many typos. There's too much this, too much that. Yeah, those are true statements, but they're published. They decided not to quit, and there they are. So my question to you is, where do you want to be? What do you want to do? I think that's really important, because the next thing to talk about, the next sort of big part of this, is how to fix a trunk novel. Thank God we're here, where I'm at least on more stable editorial ground. I can actually point to things. I can give you concrete steps, and I can stop speaking so nebulously. Mainly because I feel a little uncomfortable giving you nebulous details about the state of trunk noveldom. Because from my personal experience, I quit. I wrote for a long time. I liked writing. I was not as good at it then as I am now. But at the time when I was writing more than I was editing, more than I was coaching, more than I was doing anything, I swore up and down I'd be a writer. And I did okay. It wasn't great. Self-publishing was, super new. So I wasn't rolling things out on the river-themed mega corporations. But I was writing whole stories. They're out there somewhere. You can find them in East Coast, probably flea markets at this point. They're on one of the many hard drives I have floating around the house, floating around some of the boxes. But I wrote, and it got hard. And I got scared, and I quit. I realized that my joy was not in the writing. It didn't make me happy. I liked the idea stage, loved the idea stage. But the writing, no. Not just because typing hurts my fingers, because sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, but it just wasn't as much fun for me. It was way more fun for me to talk about writing. It was way more fun for me to talk about other people's writing. It was way more fun for me to answer questions. It was way more fun for me to nuts and bolts everything. So I made the transition from writing and poetry to editing and coaching and helping other people do better. And I was instantaneously happier. I gave myself the trunk novel label. I didn't let other people stop me. Other people told me all the time, "Oh, John, you got to get this thing published. Oh, John, this thing's great. Love it. It's fantastic." Now, granted, this was 15, 20 years ago, where I was barely sober 2 days of the week. And I imagine now, 20 years later, having coached and edited as much as I have and having read as much as I have and sober, I could probably write better. I know when I have to come up with examples for other people, my writing is apparently very good, but I have no interest in writing. I don't want to sit and write. It freaks me out. It makes me anxious. It brings me back to being that kid in college, sitting there looking at, can I name check somebody? I'll just name check her with her first name. I doubt very strongly she's listening, but hypothetically, if you know her, well, it's not really a big secret that I totally wanted to sleep with her. Well, we'll call her Carol, because maybe that was her name and maybe it wasn't. It was totally Carol. So there was Carol. She sat in front of me in my one class, and I desperately wanted to get with her. So I tried really hard to write really edgy stuff. It was the late 90s, early 2000s. So it makes me feel like that kid who couldn't figure out how to put one foot in front of the other and couldn't, oh no, disconnected. Oh no. Hang on. What a bummer. Why did it disconnect? All right, we're back. Why did it disconnect? That's so weird. Everything was going along just fine, and then all of a sudden it wasn't. I apologize. I guess it doesn't want me talking about Carol. Oh. Anyway, so I was a young kid trying to stumble my way through popularity and attention and recognition. And sitting down to write my own fiction again totally brings me back. Doesn't matter if I'm now literally 2 decades older with a world of different experience under my belt. I'm not a writer. I'm an editor. I made peace with that. I'm happy that way. And if you really want to split hairs, I'm way more of a coach than an editor. But that's a different discussion for a different day. Suffice to say, I applied the trunk novel label to myself. Don't let other people put that label on you. And if you do find yourself putting this label on you and saying, well, this is a trunk novel. This is a trunk novel. This is a trunk novel. Oh my God, did I write a trunk novel? I need you to know that it's fixable. There are things you can do. There are steps you can take. It's fixable. So we're going to identify stuff. We're going to figure out how to make this work. Here's how. So first and foremost, the thing you want to ask is this done? Meaning, is it a complete story? We're doing that first before we diagnose any other problems, because if you haven't finished the thing, there is no sense going back and taking it apart. Step 1, finish it. Even if it doesn't entirely make sense, even if there's been a substantial gap in time or talent or effort or focus or any number of other criteria, finish the thing. Because what that's going to do, no matter how much finishing needs to happen, finish it. Whether we're talking about writing an extra page, writing an extra chapter, writing 10,000 more words or whatever, having the whole story done gives you the maximum amount of flexibility and the maximum sense of awareness as to the other parts of the manuscript you're going to need to work on to untrunk, that's the technical term, untrunk this novel. So, sorry, the thing blinked at me. So, we finished the whole thing. That's going to be step 1. Step 2. Once finished, you're going to need to be able to identify from page 1 to page whenever. You're going to need to be able to identify the plot and get the plot down into 2 to 3 sentences max. And whether you want to name check people or not, that's fine. Whether you want to turn it into a pitch, that's fine. Those are all other things we can deal with at other times. But by and large, you need to be able to figure out the plot and be able to verbalize it or express it succinctly. Why do we need to do that? Because in the story triangle, the plot is one of the more concrete things we can point to. It's the thing that dominates the majority of the story space. The bulk of a story is about its plot. So developing that plot and being able to say, yes, my plot is from this to this happens, gives us a sense that there is at least some kind of spine to the manuscript. So, is it finished? What's the plot? Past that, things start to get smaller, meaning we start to look at smaller and smaller portions of story to get our answers. Now, I'm going to go to character next. But you don't have to. You can go to world next. That's fine. We're going to cover them both. I'm just doing, maybe I'll do world first and get it out of the way. But you're going to end up doing all 3 parts of the story triangle. So for the sake of this, just to kind of mix it up a little bit, to show that I'm flexible and not rigid, instead of talking about character right away, let's talk about world. So you want to be able then to take apart the world. And here are the things to look for about your world. Mouthful of tea first. Hang on. First thing you want to be able to do. And remember, we're going broad first, and then we're zeroing in. So the first thing you want to do is you want to be able to outline some, not all, but some of the rules of your world. Now, if you can do all of them, that's great. But at the very least, you need some. Now, what am I talking about? The rules of your world and I think we've covered this in world building, and I know I've covered this with some questions in the Wednesday chats. The rules of the world are the deviations from the reader's world. They're the way your story world works. This is particularly the case if you have like fantasy creatures or supernatural stuff or stuff outside the reader's experience on Earth. I'm assuming your reader is an Earthling. But you want to make sure you're able to identify at least 2 plus. It doesn't really matter how many max, just at least 2 rules of the world. Write them down. Be able to pull them out. Be able to point to specifically where in the story they are. This I'm going to make a number up. Rule number 9 comes from chapter 5. It's expressed here. I'm not asking for citations. You don't need to quote the page. You don't need to quote the number. But you do need to know what are the rules of the world and more or less where do they show up in the manuscript. And if it's real abstract, like it's Earth, but there are, wizards, well, that's a rule, and that shows up from the beginning, and it's consistent throughout the whole story. That's okay. That's fine as an answer. There's nothing wrong with that as an answer. The point is more about, can we find the structure of your world in your manuscript? So that's the next thing. Now, we've finished it. We've pulled the plot out. We've pulled some world building out. The last part of our story triangle is character. So now we're going to break this down. Now we're going to do this in layers because we're going to come back and revisit all 3 parts of our story triangle for round 2. But for now, we're just laying groundwork. So groundwork for character development is main character. Who's our main character? What goal do they have? What's their goal across the whole story? I'm using really broad terms. I'm trying to pull a lot of the jargon out because I want you to think about this in broad terms. What are they trying to do? Not just specific to the plot. Not just, they're trying to, stop the small town killer before they kill again. Do they have other things going on? They want to, fall in love with the person they're in love with and also, live happily ever after. What's their goal? And the reason we frame it this way and the reason we talk about it this way is because the pursuit of that goal should be a thing that swims its way all the way through the story. It's a through line. It's a piece of connective tissue. And I see, according to my note, that I've disconnected again. Good grief. So we're going to wait a second for it to reconnect. I apologize. I'm not getting any notification that my internet is like unstable. It's just being real finicky. Sorry. I will. Side note, future me listening to this tomorrow, it looks more and more like we're going to have to drill 2 holes in the garage and run cable. I'm really displeased about this, but if that's what I have to do, that's what I have to do. Anyway. Well, it's just, mostly it's embarrassing. I'm not wired to the router here. The router is like, 75, 85 feet down a staircase for me. And it's just a matter, it's embarrassing. I want to have a stable connection to deliver to you, good shit without it freaking out. It's what I get for having the office over the garage. So we've got our character. We have their goal. That goal is going to be one of the things that stitches its way through the whole story as a ribbon or not necessarily a spine, but a musculature if we're using an anatomical example. It's important that character have a goal beyond the main plot. This is also going to help shape their character arc, which, what? I'm sorry, Kat, I had to move the microphone. Don't look at me like that, Linus. I moved. Forgive me. So that's round 1. Basic character goal, rules of the world, the plot. Is the story complete? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Now we're going to go through and do another layer. here's where we start seeing more common elements, because usually the things that trunk the novel, the things that render it material to be walked away from, if it's not just a matter of I need to sit down and finish it, it's usually in this second layer that we encounter problems, because people mostly don't have trouble figuring out who their main character is, or what the world of the story is, or what the loose plot is. But once we dive deeper, once we push at it a little bit more, that's where we start seeing weaknesses. That's where we start seeing issues. Here come the red flags. Red flag noise. So, we're going to start again from the top. If it's complete, which we already established in past number 1 it was, if it's complete, can you identify where the act breaks are? What is Act 1? Don't worry about page numbers. Don't worry about chapter length. Don't worry about chapter numbers. Think about it in terms of scenes and actions. So we have this setup of Act 1 is the scene from, character wakes up in bed all the way through character discovers the creepy monster at the office. Or whatever Act 1 is. Again, I'm not yet looking for literally every step in the process, not every link in the chain. I'm asking you for the beginning link and the ending link. Identify your acts. Here's Act 1. Starts here, ends here. Here's Act 2. Starts here, ends here. Here's the climax. Starts here, ends here. Here's third act. Starts here, ends here. And if you're doing 5-act structure, then obviously it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But for the vast majority of people, it's going to be 3 acts. And cool, good for you that it's 3 acts. Totally fine. But be able to identify those 3 acts, because one of the most common issues is that there's not enough clear division between first and second act, and not enough division between second and climax, and certainly not enough division between climax and resolution. The story in places feels rushed. The story in places feels like it takes forever and a day to get somewhere. The story feels like it doesn't really start. These are all very common red flags that you have to deal with when you're trying to figure out act structure. Before we dive any deeper, we do the act structure first, because that's going to give us, again, we're narrowing down our scope. We're giving this more spine. We're giving this more bone structure and rigidity, not to strip the creativity out, but more to think about limitation and boundaries and simpler boxes to work in, so that we're not constantly intimidated that, we have 90,000 words and, word 88,202 is the problem. We want to think about it in simpler, more actionable terms when we're trying to turn this story, this manuscript, into something that you do want to take forward and get published. Everybody with me? We're all still good? I noticed shockingly that my entire system seems fine now. Weird. But all the same, we're going to march on. Here we go. We're marching on. So, next step. Let's start with plot. Identify in the second act. Remember now, first act ends where plot kicks off, because the second act is the build-up and continuation of plot all the way to climax. So the vast majority of your plot shit happens in your second act. That's why second acts are typically the largest of the 3 acts. Identify. Remember how before we talked about the beginning and ending link of the chain? Now we're going to start looking at links in the chain. What are the plot links? What are the plot moments? What scenes, what chapters, what pieces of the story, 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, sequentially add up to move the reader through the plot? The most common problem here is that you've either forgotten one, like you sort of brushed it aside and thought, oh, I'll get to it later, and then you never did, because books are big like that. Or that you think you've clearly described something and you kind of glossed over it. This is something under your control. Side note, I'm mentioning all these things just so that we're clear. These are all things you can do. This is, if you're curious, this is the model for revision I teach in the Novel in a Year program. I'm just now doing it on Twitch. So what are the links in the plot chain? Where does it start? What comes next? What's after that? What's after that? What's after that? What's after that? All the way through. Straightforward. Take it all the way up to the climax. And yeah, if you really get a fire under your ass, go do the climax too. But by and large, just look at the development of the plot. One thing to the next, to the next, to the next. How many things? That's important. But remember, there's no magic number. It's not like you have 11 and you're supposed to have 10. Damn you. You can have as many as you want. The minimum you have to have is 3. Only because you need something to start. You need something to develop, and you need something to lead you to climax. You need at least 3. So 3 plus. And this is going to be, we start on that. We meet the scary monster in the office. We hide from the monster. No one believes us that the monster is there. We go back the next day. We see the monster killing again. We decide we have to fight the monster. We learn about the monster. We battle the monster. We lose. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Walk through the plot. Each of those things that I just described, this happens, this happens, this happens, need to be scenes. We're going to talk about scenes in a minute, but we're looking to identify the scenes here. The vast majority of the time, it's either gone underdeveloped or you skipped something, and that's fixable. And if you've gone underdeveloped, it probably just needs to be a full scene unto itself. All right. That is good tea. That is excellent tea. I'm quite pleased with that tea. All right. What do you think, Linus? Think we should keep it moving? I think I agree, buddy. I agree. So, we have figured out our basic plot through the second act, and maybe the climax if you decided to do the climax. If you haven't, hey, guess what? This is the moment where we're going to go do the climax. And we're starting with second act and climax because they're the more critical parts of the story. The climax needs at least 2 parts, a beginning and an end. Ideally, it's got 3 parts, beginning, middle, and an end. And whether that's 1 scene, 2 scenes, 3 scenes, a chapter, 2 chapters, 10 chapters, whatever, map out the climax. This happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. The vast majority of the times where a climax has red flags, it's either because the climax itself is kind of like flying. That's not a word. Flying by. That's where I'm going. It's flying by. You're racing all the way. Flying. I can't fucking believe it. You're racing all the way through it. And you're not giving it enough detail. Or the pacing is really erratic because you're trying to build tension. Let's say you've got, one character over on the left doing a thing, and you've got a character on the right doing a different thing, and you're trying to bounce back and forth between the two, and you're not balancing out the amount of time right, so it feels like we're spending a lot of time on the one side and not the other. And when you're trying to make it feel tense, you're over manufacturing it. You're out of whack. And I'm not saying it needs to be perfectly balanced 50-50. That's a different problem altogether. But it's just not set up the way you want, doing what you want. So, work your climax. With the plot done and the climax done, we can address the ends of our spectrum. Our first act and our third act. Now, to some degree, you need these two things to more or less have a lot of similarity. Not direct copying, but a lot of the same shape. It's just that we're going to be going forward in both, but in 2 different ways. So the first act is the intro, right? The first act is our setup. It's how we meet the character. It's how we're introduced to the world. It's how we see how the writer writes. And the first act ends when the plot really gets going. So make sure you're able in your first act to identify, okay, this is where I introduce the character. This is where this is where things wrap up because I've started to talk about the plot. This is where I've shown some of the world to get the reader kind of up to speed or interested. This is where I'm, laying this out, whether that's an opening scene, a couple opening scenes, you're starting in media res, you're starting with an action beat, you're doing whatever. Map out your first act. And now, Once that's done, bounce all the way over there to your third act. The resolution, the wrap-up, the package, whatever you want to call it. It's the overall idea that all the loose threads, to the best of your ability, get tied up. Now, big red flag. So big it got 2 horns. Big red flag, because people freak out. Writers, I'll be clear with my language. Writers, I got to turn that down ever so much, Linus. Writers freak out that, oh my God, I didn't resolve anything. Oh my God, it's terrible. It's awful. It's the end of the world. It's fine. It's okay. I understand that social media makes a real big fuss about plot holes and unexplained shit and loose ends. And yes, there are going to be people who nitpick the hell out of your work. And they're going to end up asking you about, like, well, what happened to the pen? What happened, what happened to the dog? Or they'll find a small ass thing that's fairly incidental to your story, that doesn't totally matter to what you're talking about. They'll find that one thing and claim that because you didn't cover every last inch of everything, your book sucks. That's going to say way more about them than you. And it's not your job to try and patch and fix every hole in anticipation of somebody else's criticism. It's not your job to try and guess what they're going to bitch about and then fix it. It's your job to tell the best story you can as completely as you can. That doesn't mean you've got to get 100% completion like we're getting a platinum trophy in a video game. It means you're telling the best story you can as best you can. So if some things get missed, well, shit, I guess some things get missed. Not the end of the world. Don't make it the end of the world. All right. What? Don't chew that. I need that. Don't chew that wire. All right. Okay. So now we've kind of broken out the rough gist of our story. We've looked at the plot. We've looked at your act development. Now we can go back and look at character. Although, if we're being consistent, let's go back and do the world. Here's where we're going to start merely making concrete checks. Make a location list. Where do your scenes happen? Make a list. Scene 1, Scene 2, Scene 3, Scene 4, Scene 5, however many. And then just write down where they happen. House, car, office, kitchen, elevator shaft, library, public school, abandoned building number 2, whatever. Make a list. How many of these do you need? Yes, as many as you have. Just go through thing by thing, scene by scene. Where does it happen? Why is this an issue? Why is this a red flag? 2 reasons. 1, usually in a read-through, some writers find that they didn't explain where things were happening. Like, they just wanted to get into the action. They just wanted to write the scene where the ghost chases the guy across the room or whatever, but they don't detail that it's the first floor of the office building, or that it's in the parking lot and they're scared of the dark. They kind of skip the description, the setting stuff, to get to the action stuff. Really common, super fixable. Making a list helps. So, make a list. Likewise, remember when we talked about the rules of the world? As you're going through with your plot-based scene stuff, and you're making that list of scenes, one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, and you're going through the scene locations, make sure your world rules are consistent. If you establish that things work a certain way, and then all of a sudden you find you've got a scene that happens in a place that the story can't happen in, that's definitely a thing to address. But that's the first red flag, right? That's the first wrinkle part in this. Here's the other one. Patterning. I've talked about patterning a little bit, but just to go over it again, if you've not heard this before, patterning is the idea that when we're writing, whether that's starting sentences with the same words, starting paragraph with the same words, all our paragraphs show up the same length, there's some kind of repetition of material on either a sentence level, a paragraph level, a chapter level, a scene level, some kind of level. Some kind of information is being repeated over and over, and it sort of lulls the reader into a kind of like medicated coma, for lack of a better word. You know, when all your paragraphs are the same size, when all your scenes seem to be taking place in the same place, and you don't really move the characters around, or you don't develop the world enough, and it just kind of feels a little boring, like we're in a rut. One of the things we do when we make a scene list and figure out where scenes take place is we're looking for patterns. You may have them and not realize it until you make a scene list. You may have it and take a look at it and go, oh my God, every third scene takes place in the office. And I didn't mean for that to happen. And that kind of makes me feel weird, because sometimes it's okay to pattern. Sometimes it's totally fine. For instance, in a romance novel, hetero or not, chances are you're going to have your sex scenes in pretty much the same locations, usually a bedroom or in a house or in some place either intimate or sexual. You are not generally going to have your sex scene sort of like in the middle of the same place where you have the fight, because you're trying to get two different emotional tones. Or if you're writing science fiction, for instance, yeah, you might all be on the same ship, but you've got enough variation in rooms in the ship that you can kind of break things up. And creating new locations and breaking up that location patterning you've got gives you a chance to establish a bigger, more developed, and different world, so that it doesn't always feel like we're only in two rooms bouncing back and forth, like all your characters are pacing from one side to the other. Think about your locations. Think about your scene placements. And now, with that done, now we can wrap up this tier of unfuckery by talking about characters. So with character, now we're going to start looking at character arc. We talked about their goal before, but now we're going to look at their arc. And their arc's going to have some very definite parts. It's going to introduce the character's start state, which is how the character is at the beginning of the story. It's their start state, also called a starting point. It's the same thing. How is the character at the beginning? Are they, ideally there's somebody who hasn't learned the lesson or gone through the struggle that they're going to go through later in the whole story. This isn't, for example, the girl in Encanto who suddenly tells you in the first 4 minutes that she's totally okay with who she is and she understands her value, which completely fucking train wrecks that thing. And Encanto remains one of the great lost Patreon recordings. Thanks, Disney. But all the same, you want to make sure that you've got a character start state that is different from how they are at their end state. 99% of the time, you've got a character who starts one way and finishes another. Rare is it that your character starts and ends the same way, because it makes the story feel like it doesn't matter. And I'm not talking about like they're doing the same activity. We meet the character when they're having breakfast, and at the end of the story, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about their qualities as a person. Have they grown, matured, lost, risked, suffered, endured, survived, whatever? They can still do the same stuff, make breakfast, put on pants, etc. But I'm talking about their essence, their being. So their character start state gets introduced. Probably going to be in the first act. Definitely something to look at. Whether that happens on the first page or over the first scene or the several scenes, up to you entirely. But generally, by the time we hit the middle-ish, I'm making a wiggle hand gesture, ish part of the first act, we have established the character in their starting position. We don't know everything. We don't know all their backstory. We don't know the nature of their, stubble and abs and tragedy. But how they are for the story right now has been established. Middle-ish of the first act is your kind of cutoff point for that. You can do it elsewhere. Like you can have the whole first act to develop who they are. That's fine. But you definitely want to hit that midpoint with it at least underway. And then we get into the story. We get into them doing the plot. How long is that? Well, it goes until the climax. So It takes as long as it takes. Identify the character's arc. What is it? What scenes, in what locations, what scenes do they do things that directly speak to their arc? Like this scene 11, making numbers up, scene 11 is evidence of them becoming a better person because they are confronted with this behavior or they're confronted with this obstacle. Or this is a scene where they have to sacrifice something, so we are definitely risking them because they have to learn to be a hero. Whatever their arc is, point to a scene where they're doing something that fits that arc. Doesn't matter if they succeed, doesn't matter if they fail. Just have them, where are they doing stuff? Go all the way through the second act, stop at the climax. We stop at the climax because the climax is supposed to be the peak of this story mountain. By the time they come out of the climax, they are a changed character for 1+ reasons, depending on whatever it is the climax is and whatever their arc is and whatever the story's like. But you've got to get them to the climax. When they're in the climax, you want to identify the moment in the climax, whether that's a sentence or a paragraph or a statement or an action or a scene or a part of a scene. You want to identify the moment called a tipping point for a character. The tipping point for a character is when they transition from how they were in their start state to how they end up in their end state. So if their arc is to learn to be a hero, it's where they finally undergo or undertake the action that transforms them from who they were into the hero they will be. Is it they reach out their arm and grab the person before they fall? Is it the fact that they, perform the dangerous maneuver that attacks the wizard? Is it, he kicks the blonde kid in the face to win the karate tournament? Find your climax. In your third act, you need to do 2 things for your character, for their arc. 1, you need to make sure the plot's done. If your plot's not done, your third act can't really start. So you got to make sure that third act is taken care of. Whether that's, we've defeated the guy and he's totally dead, or we're pretty sure we escaped the zombies, or I totally love you. Whatever the hell the plot is, whatever the hell the climax was, make sure all that stuff's taken care of by the time the third act kicks off. Second thing you need to do is confirm that the character is no longer the same way they were in their start state. Most of the time, the thing that sort of like slams the brakes on a story's development is that the character's arc is not fully developed. Either because the writer's trying too hard to do too many things in one arc, or they're not describing it clearly enough, or the thing that they swear up and down is an arc is not significant enough. When I say significant, I don't mean like it has to impact the whole world. I mean significant like they have to do enough stuff. A character who says, "Oh, I want to learn what love is." Yes, I was totally humming the song in my head, and I almost sang it into the microphone. I want to learn about love. Well, if by the end of the book they haven't learned fuck all about love, then they have not completed their arc. Their arc was not significant. Bonus points if you just started singing you wanted to know what love is. I will swear to you, when I turn the microphone off, that's the first thing that's going to come out of my mouth. Anyway, we want to get to a point where we make sure that the character has substantially changed and we can demonstrate that to the reader. Hey, they're not the same guy they were when they started. Neat. She really did learn her valuable lesson about balancing work and love. Neat. She's gained confidence. Huzzah. Whatever. Identify it. Where does it happen in the third act? What scene? Where? That's this layer of trunk novel correction. Everybody still with me? Because we got one more layer. It's particularly crunchy. Here we go. Starting all the way back in the beginning. Remember how we made a location list? Well, now you're going to make a scene list. And if, by the way, you wanted to kind of cheat and do this early, that's fine. It still needs to be done. Make a list of scenes. And rather than just say that, scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, he goes to the office. She meets the ghost. Blah, 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 blah. We're going to dive a little deeper. Identify with each scene, whether it's a character scene that builds a character arc, whether it's a plot scene that develops the plot. Identify where it is. That's your location list from before. Identify who's in it, what characters are involved, and identify what the point of the damn scene is. Why is the scene here? What does it do? How does it help us? So that in theory, you're getting a list that says, scene 1, married couple wakes up at home involving Bob and Steve. Character arc scene for both Bob and Steve demonstrates their start state, how they are at the beginning of the story. Neither of them believe in ghosts. Both of them hate their job. They work together. Scene 2, Bob and Steve commute. Character scene speaks to the fact that they hate their job. Establishes office and world building. Scene 3, someone talks about the creepy haunted house. Plot scene. If you run into a scene that doesn't speak to character arc, doesn't speak to plot, or doesn't in some other way, shape, or form develop the world with new information to some degree, and I'm not just talking like, oh, I didn't mention trees, now I'm talking about trees. I mean, like, here's a rule of the world and I'm illustrating it. Or I've already talked about this rule, I'm going to add more detail to it. If you have a scene that doesn't meet any of those criteria, why is that scene in the book? One of the most common things with trunk novels is that they are bloated, packed with scenes that don't speak enough to world building, enough to plot, enough to character, or some combination thereof, and it's just sort of events that the character does. And there are so many of those in the story that you could lose 1, 2, 3, 4, however many, without really weakening the overall story structure. Fun fact, this is probably going to be where you spend your most time. In terms of revising to untrunk a thing, it's going to come down to, why is this scene in the book? What am I trying to say? Am I saying it elsewhere better? Could I say it elsewhere better? Why is this thing here? Can I cut it? Do that from page 1 to the end of the book, one scene at a time. If you encounter holes, like, oh shit, I need to have a scene where XYZ happens. Guess what? Go write it. Fit it in there. If you find that you have an awful lot of scenes that are just sort of taking up space because you're enamored with a turn of phrase or the visual picture you have in your head, oh my God, they're watching the sunset, but it doesn't have anything to do with character or their relationship or the plot or any goddamn thing, but you just love the fact that you have 2 characters watching the sunset. First of all, it's not the end of the world that you wrote it. It just doesn't fit here. So take it out. Copy and paste it into a different file. I'm not saying delete it. I'm not saying, yeet it into the sun. I'm not saying abandon it. I'm just saying it doesn't fit here. Take it out, put it elsewhere, preserve it, maybe use it later. It just doesn't fit here. That's the basic revision template to untrunk most trunk novels. I want to spend a couple minutes before we wrap up. I want to spend a couple minutes kind of like covering some edge cases and laying out some other possible things you might encounter when you're trying to like revitalize and reinvigorate and move a story forward after a break, time off, abandonment, etc. We already talked about bloat a little bit. Bloat is not really the term. Okay, how do I explain this? You know how when we talk about a book and we talk about publishing it, we almost always talk about word count and word count based in genre? Like, oh, you're writing a science fiction book. It's got to be this size. Don't make it any bigger than that. Oh, you're writing a detective story or a Western or a romance novel or this or that. It's got to be this size. Don't, hang on. Here, have this. Don't interpret your word count, your actual manuscript word count, as evidence of totally fucking it up if your word count is like hundreds of thousands of words more than the expected word count on some broad genre label. For example, you've got a fantasy novel. You know that at 120,000 words, in most traditional publishing circles, they're going to slap the word epic on that thing. And the expectation is that it's going to be between 120 and 220. And for whatever reason, you've got 230,000 words. Now, granted, that is a lot of words because 230,000 of anything is a lot. But you've gone through all this. You've made as many trims as you can. To you, it does not seem bloated. That doesn't automatically mean you've got a trunk novel. You've got a big book. There's a lot of stuff in it, but it does not automatically mean trunk novel just because, here's the, A, to B is your range of word count and you're over here with C. Do not automatically assume the worst case scenario. You just have a lot of words. Is it fixable? It's always fixable. You might not like some of the fixes, but it's always fixable. But don't get in the habit of saying it's supposed to be 100,000 words, 90,000 words, whatever. And the minute you're over, clutch the pearls, here comes the doom. Because it's not. Sometimes you just have a lot of words. That, by the way, is totally different than outright bloat, where you've got tons of scenes and tons of words that don't fit, but they're just sort of present. Example, you've got a very, very thin plot that you've maybe identified 4 key things. A happens, B happens, C happens, D happens, and there's a climax and a resolution. But you've never really thought about any of the connective tissue between A to B, B to C, C to D, etc. You've just, you've got these 4 stable points, and everything else is just kind of mushy until you get there. That's a problem. That's where bloat comes in. Because there's a lack of sort of vertebra. There's a lack of structure that doesn't easily segue from main thing to next thing to next thing. You've got, some great spots and a lot of mush. We don't want that. When you encounter that, when you run into that, here's the tough news. The more insubstantial, less critical stuff you have, and the fewer your concrete points, the more beneficial it is to start fresh with a blank page. And that can be really hard to hear for people. I'm not saying totally delete everything and never touch it. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying, instead of digging into the manuscript and constantly slicing it open like an autopsy, or you're gutting a fish or something and you've just got a mess of all over the stuff, start with a blank page. One piece at a time, paste it. When it works, paste it into that new file. Keep your workspace clean. Keep everything organized. I'm not saying just delete all the files. I'm saying be organized in how you work with them. Now, I'm going to speak now from 20 plus years of experience. If you don't have that many concrete scenes, if your plot's really weak, Yes, every scene needs, I can't stress that enough, every scene needs a reason for being there. Does it work with character? Does it work with plot? Does it expand the world? A scene being there just because you like it is not... obviously there are exceptions. There are times where it's okay. But by and large, that can't be the default reason for it being there. Every scene should be pointing to character, plot, world, or some combination thereof. Otherwise, why am I reading it? What does it do for the story? This is, and when we walk through scenes like that, it's the double check. It's to make sure that, oh yeah, here's why this is here. And the messier it is, and the more scenes you have in there that are nice, they sound nice and abstract. Maybe they read okay too. Because remember, we haven't talked about readability. We're just looking at the scenes abstractly. But the more we read things, the more we go, well, why is this here? What is it doing? It's not really doing anything. It's taking up space. Those are reasons to contributing to why this story stalled out. It wasn't structured enough. It wasn't developed enough. It didn't move enough. It didn't have enough inertia. It didn't have enough stuff happening. It was just, hey, you sat down and wrote a thing, and good for you for writing a thing, but now it's time to separate the writing stuff into workable stuff that we can transform into something else. I'm not saying delete it, just saying get it out of here. Just put it over there in a different pile. It's totally fine. You can use it for something else. A lot of people are very intimidated by the idea that they have to do this much work to fix it. And yeah, that can be a total bummer. You can simplify some of this down by giving it to an editor and having them help you edit it, come up with a plan for publication. A scene about sunset should somehow tie into the plot. No, not necessarily unless you're writing something about the sun, but the scene where the protagonist watches the sunset should speak to, if not the plot, something about the character, something about their arc, something about how they're feeling, something about the world. It should have a reason to be there. Why am I watching the sunset? Oh, because I was a young farm boy on Tatooine, and I once stood iconically in front of my uncle's garage and watched the suns and felt like my destiny was in the stars, and now I, in my deathbed, sit there on a rock and watch the suns, knowing that I've come full circle in my story. There's a reason why I'm watching the sunset. It's not directly related to the plot, but it speaks to character. If it doesn't speak to plot or character, it should speak to the world. You want to try and avoid situations of just because. I'm not talking about like you write a sentence where Bob watches the sunset and then the next paragraph it's morning again. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about it being a whole ass scene. Because here's the other fun thing about trunk novels. This is not solved at a per word level. If you're a writer who has to cut 10, 20, 30, 40,000 words out of your manuscript, or you have to find your story in a 200,000 word mess, you are not going to find it by trimming out the word that from chapter 10. You were going to find it working at a scene level. You were going to find it making what presumably would be difficult decisions for you in order to figure out what is and isn't in this story. Because the most common red flag, the most common issue that people run into is that they are too deeply connected to their text. They love what they wrote. And good for them. It's great. They made art. They're happy with it. But it's become dysfunctional in that it doesn't serve a unit. It doesn't serve a use. I just wrote it just because. I wrote it to write it because I wanted to write it. And that's fine. But remember, we're trying to accomplish a goal beyond just, hey, I wrote this. We're trying to turn this into a thing, a piece of paper that another human being who isn't you can read and get the same mental picture in their head. We're trying to put a movie into your brain. There's plenty of moving parts. We don't need these extra ones. So it's not going to come down to, I gotta cut 70,000 words. Yep. Going line by line, word by word is not really going to do it. Maybe for 1 in 100 cases it could. But the vast majority, it's going to come down to, what's your plot? What are your scenes? Why are your scenes in the position they are? Why are they there? What are they trying to do? One last point before we get out of here. I broadly alluded to this before. Don't confuse unpublishable for unmarketable. Unpublishable is a fixable condition. You can make something publishable. Self-publishing allows for that. There's a great deal of latitude for it. Unmarketable is somewhat out of your hands. Because there's two conditions to unmarketable. There's what's called unmarketable by premise and unmarketable by action. So unmarketable by premise is you picking a story topic that just isn't a good one. And that might mean it's very controversial or salacious, or it doesn't have an active, like a real active audience, like you're writing some real far out red flag, danger, Will Robinson, danger, oh my God, you're writing what kind of shit now book? That given the mode of publishing you want, like you want to traditionally publish it, in particular with traditional publishing, it's unmarketable by premise. Your idea, and I've seen some far out shit, like stuff that's particularly triggering or violent or sexually aggressive or transgressive or, real intentionally controversial might be a good phrase for it. That's usually your most common flavor of unmarketable by premise. But there's also a different version of unmarketable by premise, which is your shit's too similar to somebody else's. You see this when you get a writer who's transitioning out of fan fiction into something else. They're used to playing in somebody else's sandbox, and it's time now for them to get their own tools in their own sandbox and try something bigger. And a lot of people just clone stuff. Oh, you're doing Wizards in a School? Okay. How similar to the big famous Wizards in a School book are you doing? Oh, you're doing a detective, like a wizard detective? Okay. How similar to the other famous wizard detective story are you doing? Unmarketable by premise is generally fixed by making some decisions that lead to tough choices. Because if you're working at a premise level, it's going to end up affecting big chunks of the manuscript. People are going to end up not being wizards, not being in private schools, not having noseless Shakespearean villains, etc. Big changes. Unmarketable by action is a book that's complete, a book that's good, a book that's done. But for whatever reason, given that you want to, and you usually see this in traditional publishing, it's not popular. It's just the moment is past. We're no longer doing zombies. Stop trying to make zombies popular. We're over zombies. That kind of thing. You're gonna see that in the next couple, maybe 4 or 5 months, when we kind of transition or try to transition away from pandemic fiction, where all of a sudden, like, we get it. We've been in the pandemic now for years. We've been in this kind of weird limbo state of existing but not existing. We don't always need to form our romances around illness. Unmarketable by action just means publishing has moved on from this. It's no longer the active trend or zeitgeist you intended when you sat down to write it. Or you've decided to write in a genre that, at least in terms of traditional publishing, isn't popular anymore. Example, what's called the hero Western, which is the classic Good guy wearing white hat, bad guy wearing black hat. Western. The black and white Western of the serials from 60, 70 years ago. Those are hero Westerns. Those are out of, I mean, you can still write them. You can absolutely write them, and traditional publishing will accept them, but they'll fall to the back burner because they're just not a popular genre right now. And because it's a tough sell, because it won't have the big response from an audience, because it won't lead to many cash transactions, because it won't put money in the pocket of your pimp or your publisher or somebody else, they're going to claim it's a trunk novel. They're going to claim it's unmarketable. They're going to claim it's unpublishable. And they're going to blur that line because it serves them to blur that line. But that's dumb. That's stupid. That's them trying to control the way this thing works. You can write a publishable novel that is unmarketable based on how it is you want to publish it. And you're going to see a lot of this at the traditional level. Because if you're self-publishing it, throw that sucker out there. Write some sales copy. It doesn't matter if it's a hero Western that's a throwback to the serials from way back in the day. It doesn't matter if you're writing a doctor-patient romance novel. It doesn't matter if you're doing a romantic ghost story. It doesn't matter if you're writing Southern Gothic. I don't know. If you're self-publishing it, the big unmarketable problem would be unmarketable in premise. Because you'll just get tagged as the person, the author who creates salacious, controversial stuff. Now, maybe there is an audience for it. I don't know. Maybe you're writing really fascist shit. I don't know. There's an audience for it, and depending on how you market it, you can reach some of them. Maybe not all of them, but some. I don't know. Depends on what you're writing. But at least in terms of unmarketable by act, self-publishing defeats that. But the last point I really want to make to tie this all together is that it's practice. It's all practice. Writing is one of those things, just like most creative arts, where even when it doesn't work perfectly to get you the end result you intended, you can still learn something from the doing of it. You know, you make a mistake cooking, yeah, you might have to throw the meal out, but maybe not. Maybe it just needs more flavor. Maybe you need to add more water next time, or use chicken broth, or, let it cook a little bit longer, or let it cook a little bit less. It's still edible, but it's not the Pinterest board, Instagram super sensation that you thought. And that's okay. You made dinner. You won't starve. Good job. Maybe it's totally, shit in a bucket, and it's time to go make something else or order out or something. And that's fine. You can learn from every experience, even if you don't get the outcome you want. Just like a trunk novel. It's all practice if you choose to look at it that way and choose to push back against the narrative that, oh, well, a trunk novel is some kind of sign that I need to quit writing. A trunk novel is a real problem. A trunk novel means I'm not good at this. No, it just means whatever iteration of whatever thing you're doing didn't work. Try again. Learn from it. Piece it together. What didn't work here? Why did we stall out? Do you need to make decisions? Do you need to make fewer decisions? Do you need to nail things down? Do you need to stop overly romanticizing things in your head? Like, find the lessons. They might be uncomfortable, but find the lessons. And if you can't find the lessons yourself, ask for help. Get the help you need. And go from there. You can do this. You can write your guts out and write a trunk novel that you can be proud of, that just, given how you want to market it, isn't publishable at the time. Or you can take a thing you did write and come back to it and apply this stuff and untrunk it. Turn it into something. You totally can. It might take some work. It might take some effort. You might not always be real pleased about it. It might be real frustrating, but it is doable. And if all of that happens and you're overwhelmed or you get lost, ask for help. There's nothing wrong with that. But at no point in any of this should you draw the conclusion that the only thing you can do is give up. Because that's not what this is about. It's not about giving up at all. It's just about learning and trying something different and pushing yourself. And keep making art. That's the best thing you can do. Any questions about anything we covered in the last 2 hours? Right. Sorry, microphone's over here. I am still, I think, learning how to manage you're very welcome, manage the dispensation of information. I tend, at least I'm told by people who check out the YouTube stuff after the fact. This will be up on YouTube, by the way. It'll be up tomorrow on YouTube. That's Tuesday. The audio will be on the podcast feed probably later tonight. And this will be available as a VOD on Twitch for 10 days or something. So I'm still learning the dispensation because apparently, according to people, I tend to just like vomit out stuff. I drown you in stuff. I'm still learning how to like pick and choose my spots and slow down. And I appreciate your patience. And I do read every single comment. So even the weird one from bots that encourage me to like add more graphics and I can, buy genital increasing ointment. Those are still my favorite. But yeah. Thanks so much for liking this. Thanks so much for letting me talk about it. It's certainly a deeper, I don't know what's wrong with my face. A deeper topic. But one I certainly like to talk about. The next time we will talk, by the way, since I'm sitting here looking at my calendar, the next time we'll talk will be on Wednesday, January the 19th. That's 2 days from now, with the Writer's Chat. The questions are in place. The graphics are made. And I look forward to seeing you there. As I said, this will be up on the podcast as an audio for your ear holes tonight. It will be on YouTube tomorrow at some point. I'm not sure when. It's one of those things where I'm going to like set it to upload now or like in an hour from now. And then it'll be like breakfast time and it's still uploading. And then all of a sudden I'll blink and it'll be done. I don't understand how that works. It's crazy. But yes, if you go jump on the podcast link, which is Spreaker.com. If you go to Spreaker.com, you can just search for John Helps You Tell Your Story, and it'll come right up. And there's a ton of other stuff there, and I'm adding more back to it all the time now that I've learned how to make audio for this stuff. I'm going to try and run it so that there's podcast audio and these streams, and they're pretty much the same, although I will tell you a small secret. Usually I start recording for the podcast like 2 to 5 minutes ahead of the stream, so you get some like extra stuff. You get to hear me yell at a cat or like talk to myself or leave small notes for you. So that's always fun. But yeah, you can totally check out tons of stuff on the podcast, and I will see you guys Wednesday, 2 days from now at 7 p.m. Eastern. For this week's Writer's Chat. And if you have any questions, any issues, any whatevers, you can find me on Twitter, twitter.com/awesome_John. Jump on the Discord, ask all the questions you want, and leave comments appropriately as you so desire. And I will talk to you guys very, very soon. Have a great night. Thanks for being here. You're amazing. Don't give up. Keep writing. I see you. You're doing great. We'll talk soon.